What's going on, ladies and gents? This is Bento, and today's video is kind of like a brief overview about all of the general controllers that can be used on the Steam platform. So over the past 2 years, since the release of the Steam controller, Valve, or Steam, or whatever you want to call it, has pretty much been very good about implementing some of the mainstream console controllers onto the Steam platform. So what this means is, instead of just using your general keyboard, if you want to use a controller for any type of game, you pretty much have the availability of all three console types: the Switch, the PS4, and the Xbox One. So today, I'll be giving a general description, kind of briefly highlighting some of the key features on each controller, explaining some differences between each of the controller types and what makes them unique, and I'll kind of give my own personal take about who would ideally want this type of controller. That way you guys can have a better understanding of the different controllers, as well as a better idea of what you might want. So first, let's talk about the Steam controller. Now at a glance, the Steam controller features two trackpads, dual stage triggers, which means that each of the triggers have two button functionalities, extra grip buttons in the back, wireless capabilities using its included USB dongle, as well as Bluetooth, motion control support, as well as added button customizability in the Steam platform. Now what this means for the Steam controller is that you get a package that sort of encompasses a tightly emulated keyboard and mouse. As weird as it sounds, the trackpad and the motion controls are kind of what helps with that. So because the trackpad is essentially sort of a trackball movement, it helps emulate the mouse movement that you can only really give to RTS games or even top-down style games like Divinity, for example. But those trackpads pretty much help ease that flow, and so you can really play RTS games, you can really play top-down style games just using the trackpad itself. It takes a bit of practice, but you eventually get comfortable with it, and you can pretty much just play any type of top-down game wherever you like. Now for the motion controls, because it offers that type of aim, it's almost analogous to using your mouse in terms of precision, but it's not exactly going to replace it anytime soon, so don't expect to be like really good in comparison to your normal mouse skills. But when it comes to emulating that on the controller, that is what I think the motion control really excels at. Now the Steam controller isn't without some of its caveats. One of the biggest things that a lot of people aren't really going to like about it initially is the lack of D-pad. This may be a little game breaking because some people really like that D-pad control for side-scrolling games or just general usage overall, so the lack of one may be a little turn-off for some. The other thing about the Steam controller is that it is shaped a little weirdly in the sense that it's more concave towards the top end of the controller, whereas most console controllers are sort of convex or taper outward towards the top. And this is because this is to allow the trackpads to have full coverage whenever you're using your thumbs. It will feel a little weird to use at first if you want to get used to it, and I've eventually gotten used to it too, but for some it might be a little weird to hold and it might not be towards your preference, so just something to keep note of if you do plan on owning a Steam controller. Up next we have the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller. Now this controller has a typical button layout, so sort of analogous to the Xbox One control scheme or any third-party controller for that matter. It also features motion control support, Bluetooth connection for any wireless play, button press triggers, and by this I mean it's sort of analogous to DualShock 1 and DualShock 2 levels of triggers, where the L2 and R2 are buttons rather than like depth triggers. And lastly, it has full button customizability for when you want to use it in the Steam platform. So as a whole, you're looking at a controller that has the typical button layout but the added benefit of motion controls. And I think this is helpful for a lot of shooting games, for third-person and FPS games where you need some kind of precision aim, rather than just using the joysticks themselves. If you've ever played Splatoon, then you kind of know how this feels, or if you've ever tried it. But if you prefer not to have it, then you can just use the joysticks themselves. Now for the triggers, that's up to your preference whether you prefer to just have quick-fire presses, and if you do, then I think the Pro Controller might be just for you. The other thing is, the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller is also rather hefty, which I kind of like because it feels good in your hands and it's not super light. And this makes it a lot easier for motion control aiming actually, so you don't have to really jerk your hands around too much, and the weightiness of it kind of adds to the aim if anything. Now the downside to this controller is that it's rather expensive in comparison to the other controllers on this list, priced normally at $69.99 US. Most of the other controllers are priced at around $59.99, and I think the Steam controller is currently priced at $49.99. So unless you own a Nintendo Switch, you're most likely not going to own the Pro Controller unless you really want to. The extra price tag is also primarily because of the amiibo functionality, so unless Valve decides to use it, or for some reason amiibos are now functional for Steam, you may want to be careful of purchasing this product unless you think you know this is for you. Next we have the PlayStation 4 controller, and this controller is almost typical of that of normal button layouts on other controllers like the Switch and the Xbox One, but it does feature its PlayStation 4 layout, in which case the D-pad and the left analog stick are switched. But it also features motion controls, a touchpad functionality, has Bluetooth connection, and is fully customizable on the Steam platform. Much like the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, the DualShock 4 controller has almost your typical style layout in terms of buttons, but also the added benefit of motion controls as well as a touchpad if you want to use that as well. I like the motion controls again for FPS and shooting. The D-pad being on the top left is also an added benefit for side-scrolling games, particularly Hollow Knight, Shovel Knight, or any of the side-scrolling games you want to play. I don't really use the touchpad that often, but when I do, I like using it for mouse style movements on sometimes on the desktop actually. I don't really use it too much for RTS or top-down style games because I think the Steam controller is better in that regard. But if you prefer to have your typical button layout but a touchpad that is there at least if you wanted to, then I think the PS4 controller might just be for you. Now in terms of downsides for the DualShock 4 controller, I don't really like the triggers that much. I think they're a little too sharp, or they don't feel as good to press in comparison to the Xbox One controller or even the Steam controller. I would much prefer those in terms of pressing, and I would rather have the L1 and R1 be my primary means of shooting in FPS or even third-person games. Lastly, we have the Xbox One controller. Now unfortunately, I don't have an Xbox One controller because I don't own an Xbox, so I kind of don't really feel the need to own one, but I still think there are some things worth mentioning about the controller itself. Firstly, it does feature a typical button layout. It also has Bluetooth support, and it is fully customizable by the Steam platform. Now unlike the other three controllers, the Xbox One controller is very bare bones. It doesn't have motion controls, it doesn't have any dual stage triggers, there's not a lot of added functionality to it, but it is in some regard kind of good because if you just want to get into a game and you don't want to mess with the control scheme that much, then I think the Xbox One controller might be good for you. But if you want to look into any other type of functionality, you might have to look at the other three controllers instead. So overall, there is a wide variety of controllers you can choose from to use on your Steam platform. You have the choice of your Steam controller, the Nintendo Switch, the PS4, and the Xbox One controller. Most likely though, you'll probably end up using the same controller that you use on your consoles that you want to use on your Steam platform. And I don't blame you, because buying controllers is kind of expensive unto itself. But if you want the added functionality of using motion controls, touchpad controls, or you want a different level of controls to use on your Steam platform, then you do have that option. Personally speaking, I think you should pick your controller that is comfortable for you and one that you think you'll use as kind of like your daily driver. Well, assuming you use controllers on PC as your daily driver. But pick one that's comfortable, pick one that's good for you, and I think you'll be a lot happier with your gaming experience. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you all next time.